Hans, the Mermaid's son. In a village there once lived a smith called Basmus, who was very poor. He was still a young man, and strong, handsome fellow to boot. But he had many little children, and there was little to be earned by his trade. He was, however, diligent and a hard-working man, and when he had no work in the smithy, he was out at sea fishing, or gathering wreckage on the shore. It happened one time that he had gone out to fish in good weather, all alone in his little boat, but he did not come home that day, nor the following one, so that all believed he had perished out at sea. On the third day, however, Basmus came to shore again, and had his boat full of fish, so big and fat that no one had ever seen their like. There was nothing the matter with him, and he complained neither of hunger or thirst. He had got into a fog, he said, and he could not find the land again. What he did not tell, however, was there he had been all that time. That only came out 6 years later, when people got to know that he had been caught by a mermaid out on the deep sea, and had been her guest during the 3 days that he was missing. From that time forth he went out no more to fish, nor indeed did he require to do so, for whenever he went down to the shore, it never failed that some wreckage was washed up, and it was all kinds of valuable things. Those days everyone took what they found and got leave to keep it, so that a smith grew more prosperous day by day. When 7 years had passed since Smith went out to sea, it happened one morning, as he stood in the smithy pending a plough, that some handsome young lad came in to him and said, "Good day, father. My mother the mermaid sends her greetings, and says that she has had me for 6 years now, and you can keep me for as long." He was a strange enough boy to be 6 years old, for he looked as if he were 18, and was even bigger and stronger than the lads, commonly are at that age. "Will you have a bite of bread?" said Smith. "Oh, yes," said Hans, because, that's his name. The smith then told his wife to cut a piece of bread for him. She did so, and the boy swallowed it at one mouthful and went out again to the smithy, his father. "Have you had all you can eat?" said Smith. "No," said Hans. "That was just a little bit." The smith went to the house and took a whole loaf, which he cut into 2 slices and put butter and cheese between. Then he gave it to Hans. In a while the boy came back to the smithy again. "Well, have you got as much to eat as you can?" asked the smith. "No, not nearly," said Hans. "I must try to find a better place than this, for I can see that I shall never get my fill here." Hans wished to be set off at once, and as soon as his father would make a staff for him, or such of a kind as he wanted. "It must be of iron," he said, "and one that can hold out." The smith brought him an iron rod as thick as an ordinary staff, but Hans took it and twisted it around his finger, so that wouldn't do. Then the smith came dragging one as thick as a wagon pole, but Hans bent it over his knee and broke it like a straw. The smith then had to collect all the iron he had, and Hans held it while his father forged for him a staff, which was heavier than the anvil. When Hans got his, he said, "Many thanks, father. Now I've got my inheritance." With that he set off into the country, and the smith was very pleased to get rid of that son before he ate him out of house and home. Hans first arrived at a large estate, and so it happened that the squire himself was standing outside the farmyard. "Where are you going?" said the squire. "I'm looking for a place," said Hans, "where they have need of a strong fellow and can get plenty to eat." "Well," said the squire, "I generally have 24 men at this time of the year, but I only have 12 just now, so I can easily take you on." "Very well," said Hans. "I shall easily do 12 men's work, but then I must also have as much to eat as a 12 would." All this was agreed to, and the squire took Hans into the kitchen, and told the servant girls that the new man was to have as much food as the other 12. It was arranged that he should have a pot to himself, and he could then use the ladle to take his food with. It was in the evening that Hans arrived there, so he did nothing more than eat his supper, a big pot of buckwheat porridge, which he cleaned to the bottom, and was then so far satisfied that he said he could sleep on that, and so he went off to bed. He slept both well and long, and all the rest were up at their work while he was still sleeping soundly. The squire was also on foot, for he was curious to see how the new man would behave, who was both to eat and work for 12. But as yet there was no Hans to be seen, and the sun was already high in the heavens, so the squire himself went and called on him. "Get up, Hans," he cried. "You're sleeping too long." Hans woke up and rubbed his eyes. "Oh, that is true," he said. "I must get up and have my breakfast." So he rose and dressed himself and went into the kitchen, where he got his pot of porridge. He swallowed all of this, and then asked what work he was to have. He was to thresh the day, and said the squire, "The other 12 men are already busy at it." There were 12 threshing floors, and the 12 men were at work on 6 of them, 2 on each. Hans must thresh by himself all that was lying upon the other 6 floors. He went out to the barn and got hold of a flail. Then he looked to see how the others did it, and he did the same. But at the first stroke he smashed the flail into pieces. There were several flails hanging there, and Hans took one after the other, but they all went the same way, every one flying in splinters at the first stroke. He then looked around for something else to work with, and found a pair of strong beams lying near. He next caught sight of a horse ride nailed up on a barn door. With the beams he made a flail, using the skin of the tie to tie them together. The one beam he used as a handle, the other to strike with, and now that was all right for him. But the barn was too low, and there was no room to swing the flail, and the floors were too small. Hans, however, found a remedy for this. He simply lifted the roof off of the barn and set it down in the field beside. He then emptied down all the corn that he could lay on his hands and threshed away. He went through one lot after another, and it was all the same to him that he got hold of. So before midday he had threshed all the squire's grain, his rye, his wheat, barley, and oats, all mixed through each other. When he was finished with this, he lifted up the roof on the barn again, and setting it like a lid on the box, then went in and told the squire that the job was done. The squire opened his eyes at this announcement and came out to see if this was really true. It was true enough, but he had scarcely delighted with the mixed grain that he got from all of his crops. However, when he saw the flail that Hans used and learned how he made room for himself to swing it, he was so afraid of the strong fellow that he dared not say anything, except that it was a good thing he had got it threshed, but it still had to be cleaned. "What do you mean?" asked Hans. It was explained to him that the corn and the chaff had to be separated, as yet both they were lying in one heap, right up to the roof. Hans began to take up a little and sift it with his hands, but he soon saw that this would never do. He soon thought of a plan, however. He opened both barn doors, then lay down on one end and blew, so that all the chaff flew out and lay like a sandbank at the other end of the barn. And then the grain was as clean as could be. He then reported to the squire that job also was done. The squire said that was well. There was nothing more for him to do that day. Off went Hans to the kitchen and got as much as he could eat. Then he went and took a midday nap, which lasted until supper time. Meanwhile, the squire was quite miserable and made his moan to his wife, saying that she must help him find some means of getting rid of the strong fellow, for he does not wish to give him leave. She sent for the steward, and it was arranged the next day that all the men should go to the forest for firewood, and that they should make a bargain among them, that the one who came home last with his load should be hanged. They thought they could easily manage that it would be Hans who would lose his life, for the others would be early on the road, while Hans would certainly oversleep himself again. In the evening, therefore, the men sat and talked together, saying that the next morning they must set out early for the forest, as they had a hard day's work and a long journey before them. They would, for their amusement, make a compact that whichever of them came home last with his load should lose his life on the gallows. So Hans made no objection to make. Long before the sun was up next morning, all 12 men were on foot. They took all the best horses and carts and drove off to the forest. Hans, however, lay and slept on, and the squire said, "Just let him lie." At last, Hans thought it was time to have his breakfast, so he got up and put on his clothes. He took plenty of time to his breakfast, and then went out to get his horse and cart ready. The others had taken everything that was of any good, so that he had a difficulty in scraping together 4 wheels of different sizes and fixing them to the old cart, and he could find no other horses than a pair of old hacks. He did not know where it lay, but he followed the track of the other carts, and in that way came to it all right. On coming to the gate leading to the forest, he was unfortunate enough to break it into pieces, so he took a huge stone that was lying on the field, 7 ells long and 7 ells broad, and set this in the gap. Then he went on and joined the others. These laughed at him heartily, for they had labored as hard as they could since daybreak, and had helped each other to fell trees and put them in the carts, so that all these were now loaded, except one. Hans got a hold of a woodsman's axe and proceeded to fell a tree, but he destroyed the edge and broke the haft at his first blow. He therefore laid down the axe and put his arms around a tree and pulled it up by the roots. This he threw upon the cart, and then another, and thus he went on, while all the others forgot their work and stood with mouths open, gazing at this strange woodcraft. All at once they began to hurry. The last cart was loaded, and they whipped up their horses so that they would be the first to arrive home. When Hans had finished his work, he again put his old hacks into the cart, but they could not move it from the spot. He was annoyed with this, and took them out again, twisted the rope around the cart and all the trees, and lifted the whole affair on his back, and set off home, leading the horses behind him by the reins. When he reached the gate, he found the whole row of carts standing there, unable to get any further because of the stone which lay in the way. "What?" said Hans. 12 men cannot move that stone?" And with that he lifted it and threw it out of the way, and went on with his burden on his back and the horses behind him, and arrived at the farm long before any of the others. The squire was walking about there, looking and looking, for he was very curious to know what had happened. Finally he caught sight of Hans coming up along in his fashion, and was so frightened that he did not know what to do but shut the gate and put on the bar. When Hans reached the gate of the courtyard, he laid down his trees and hammered at, but no one came to open it. Then he took the trees and tossed them over the barn into the yard, and the cart after them, so that every wheel flew off in different directions. When the squire saw this, he thought to himself, "The horses will come the same way if I don't open the door." So he did. "Good day, master," said Hans, and put the horses into the stable and went into the kitchen to get something to eat. At length the other men came home with their loads. When they came in, Hans said to them, "Do you remember the bargain we made last night? Which of you is going to be hanged?" "Oh," they said, "that was only a joke. It didn't mean anything." "Oh, well, it doesn't matter," said Hans, and there was no more about it. The squire, however, and his wife and the steward had much to say to each other about the terrible man they had got, and all were agreed that they must get rid of him in some way or another. The steward said that he could manage this all right. The next morning they were to clean the well, and they would use that opportunity. They would get him down into the well, and then have a big millstone ready to throw on down on top of it, and that would settle him. After that, they could just fill the well, and then escape being at any expense of his funeral. Both the squire and his wife thought this was a splendid idea, and went about rejoicing at the thought that they would now get rid of Hans. But Hans was hard to kill, as you'll see. He slept long next morning, as he always did, and finally he would not waken by himself. The squire had to go and call him. "Get up, Hans, you're sleeping too long," he cried. Hans woke up and rubbed his eyes. "That's so," said he. "I shall rise and have my breakfast." He got up and then dressed himself, while the breakfast stood waiting for him. When he had finished the whole of this, he asked what he was to do today. He was told to help the other men to clean out the well. Well, that was all right, and he went out and found the other men waiting for him. To these he said that they should choose whichever task they liked, either go down into the well and fill the buckets while he pulled them up, or pull them up, and he alone would go down to the bottom of the well. They answered that they would rather stay above ground, and there would be no room for so many of them down in the well. Hans therefore went down alone, and began to clean out the well. But the men had arranged how they were to act, and immediately each of them seized a stone from a huge heap of blocks and threw them down above him, thinking to kill him with these. Hans, however, gave no more heed to this than to shout up at them and keep the hens away from the well, for they are scraping gravel down on top of him. Then they saw they could not kill him with little stones, but they had still the big one left. The whole 12 of them set to work with poles, rollers, and rolling the big millstone to the brink of the well. It was with the greatest difficulty that they had got it thrown down there, and now they had no doubt that he had gotten all that he wanted. But the stone happened to fall so luckily that his head went right through the hole in the middle of the millstone, so that it sat around his neck like a priest's collar. At this, Hans would stay down no longer. He came out of the well with a millstone around his neck and went straight to the squire and complained that the other men were trying to make a fool of him. He would not be their priest, he said. He had too little learning for that. Saying this, he bent down his head and took off the stone, that it crushed one of the squire's toes. The squire went limping into his wife, and the steward was sent for. He was told that he must devise some plan of getting rid of this terrible person. The scheme had been devised before had been no use, and now good counsel was getting scarce. "Oh no," said the steward. "There are good enough ways yet. The squire can send him on the fishing in the evening in Devilmoss Lake. He will never escape from there. No one ever can go there by the night of old Eric." That was a grand idea, both the squire and his wife thought, and so he limped out again to Hans, and said he would punish his men for having tried to make a fool of him. Meanwhile, Hans could do a little job where he would be free of these rascals. He should go out on the lake and fish there that night, and then be free from all work the following day. "All right," said Hans. "I am well content with that, but I must have something with me to eat. Baking of bread, cask of butter, a barrel of ale, and a keg of brandy. I can't do with less than that." The squire said that he could easily get all that, so Hans got all of these tied together, hung them over his shoulder with his good staff, and tramped away to Devilmoss Lake. He got into the boat and rowed out upon the lake, and got everything ready to fish. As he now lay there in the middle of the lake, and it was pretty late in the evening, he thought he would have something to eat first, before starting his work. Just as he was at his busiest with this, old Eric rose out of the lake, caught him by the cuff of the neck, whipped him out of the boat, and dragged him down to the bottom. It was a lucky thing that Hans had his walking stick with him that day, and had just time to catch hold of it when he felt old Eric's claws in his neck. So when he got down to the bottom, he said, "Stop now, wait a little, here's solid ground." And with that he caught old Eric by the back of the neck with one hand, and hammered away on his back with the staff, till he beat him out as flat as a pancake. Old Eric then began to lament and howl, begging him just to let him go, and he would never come back to the lake again. "Now, my good fellow," said Hans, "you won't get off until you promise to bring all the fish in the lake up to the squire's courtyard before tomorrow morning." Old Eric eagerly promised this if Hans would only let him go. So Hans rowed ashore and ate up the rest of his provisions, then went home to bed. The next morning, when the squire rose and opened his front door, the fish came tumbling onto the porch, and the whole yard was crammed full of them. He ran again to his wife, for he could never devise anything himself, and said to her, "What shall we do with him now? Old Eric hasn't taken him. I'm certain that all the fish are out of the lake, and the yard is just filled with them." "Yes, that's a bad business," she said. "You must see if you can't get him sent to purgatory, or as demand tribute." The squire therefore made his way to his men's quarters to speak to Hans, and it took him all his time to push his way along the wall under the eaves, on account of all the fish that were filling the yard. He thanked Hans for having fished so well, and said that now he must do an errand for him, which he could only give to a trusty servant, and that was to journey to purgatory and demand 3 years' tribute, which, he said, was owing to him for that quarter. "Willingly," said Hans, "but what road do I go to get there?" The squire stood and did not know what to say, and had first said to go unto his wife to ask her. "Oh, what a fool you are," she said. "You can't direct him straight forward, south through the wood. Whether he gets there or not, we shall be quit of him." Out goes the squire to Hans. "The way lies straight forward, south, through the wood," he said. Hans then said he must have provisions for his journey, 2 bakings of bread, 2 casks of butter, 2 barrels of ale, and 2 kegs of brandy. He tied all these up together and got them on his shoulder, hanging on his good walking stick, and he tramped off southward. After he had got through the wood, there was more than one road, and he was in doubt which of them was the right way, so he sat down and opened his bundle of provisions. He found he had left his knife at home, but by good chance there was a plough lying close at hand, so he took the coulter of this and cut the bread. Then he sat there and took his bite. A man came riding past him. "Where are you from?" said Hans. "From Purgatory," said the man. "Then stop and wait a little," said Hans. But the man was in a hurry and would not stop, so Hans ran after him and caught the horse by the tail. This brought it down on its hind legs, and the man went flying over its head into a ditch. "Just wait a little," said Hans. "I'm going the same way." He got his provisions tied up and laid them on the horse's back. Then he took a hold of the reins and said to the man, "We two can go along together on foot." As they went on their way, Hans told the stranger both about the errand he had on hand and the fun he had had with old Eric. The other man said but little, but he was well acquainted with the way, and it was no long time before they had arrived at the gate. There both horse and rider disappeared, and Hans was left alone outside. "They will come and let me in presently," he thought to himself. But no one came. He hammered at the gate. Still no one appeared. Then he got tired of waiting and smashed at the gate with his staff until he knocked it in pieces and got inside. A whole troop of little demons came down upon him and asked what he wanted. "His master's compliments," said Hans, "and he wanted 3 years' tribute." At this they howled at him, and they were about to lay hold of him and drag him off. But when they got some raps from his walking stick, they let go again. Howled still louder than before, and ran into old Eric, who was still in his bed after his adventure in the lake. They told him that a messenger had come from the squire at Devilmoss to demand 3 years' tribute. He had knocked the gates to pieces and bruised their arms and legs with his iron staff. "Give him 3 years, give him 10, shouted old Eric. "Only don't let him come near me." So all the little demons came dragging so much silver and gold that it was something awful. Hans filled his bundle with gold and silver coins and put it on his neck, and he tramped back to his master, who was scared beyond all measure at seeing him again. But Hans was also tired of service now. Of all the gold and silver he brought with him, he let the squire keep half, and he was glad enough, both for the money and getting rid of Hans. The other half he took home to his father, the smith at Furby. To him he also said, "Farewell." He was now tired of living on shore among mortal men, and preferred to go home again to his mother. Since that time, no one has ever seen Hans, the mermaid's son.